Starting in 1969, the film begins by showing two fighter jets patrolling near the South Korean and North Korean border. The two pilots, Tae-in and his junior, Dong-chul, are seen performing aerobatics to practice their skills during their patrol. However, in the middle of their training, they receive an emergency call from headquarters, alerting them to a commercial plane that is about to enter the restricted airspace. This area is prohibited for civilian aircraft due to its proximity to the North Korean border. Without hesitation, Tae-in and Dong-chul immediately instruct the plane to turn back. At this point, they briefly see the pilot's face and recognize him as a senior officer from the Air Force. Strangely, there is no response from him. Unexpectedly, it turns out that the pilot is being held at gunpoint by a man. In this increasingly tense situation, headquarters orders Tae-in and Dong-chul to shoot part of the plane's engine so the pilot can make an emergency landing. However, Tae-in hesitates to fire, worried that a failed attempt could kill the civilians on board. The plane continues to fly until it crosses into North Korean airspace, and Tae-in can only watch in silence, regretting his decision not to shoot. Because of this hesitation, Tae-in and Dong-chul are immediately called to the Air Force headquarters. At that moment, the commander expresses deep regret over Tae-in's decision to let the plane enter North Korea, especially since 51 civilians are now at risk of being killed by the communist country's soldiers. Tae-in then explains that he couldn't fire because the plane had been hijacked. However, he is unable to prove this to the commander. In the end, the commander orders Tae-in to resign from the Air Force, while Dong-chul is suspended for a month. Before Tae-in leaves, the military official reminds him that his actions were unwise, as even though he acted in the name of humanity, the risk he took was too great. Now, the issue has escalated and worsened the conflict between South Korea and North Korea. A year later, various media outlets report that the South Korean government continues to negotiate with North Korea to release all the passengers. Unfortunately, the communist state only agrees to release 40 people, while the remaining 11 will be detained, as they are considered to possess special skills that could be useful to the North Korean government. At the same time, Tae-in and his wife visit the wife of the pilot who is still trapped in North Korea. However, the people in the pilot's neighborhood accuse him of being a communist spy for flying the plane into the neighboring country. The gate of the pilot's house is even vandalized with insulting words, despite the fact that the plane was clearly hijacked. Inside the house, the pilot's wife is seen cooking delicious food to welcome Tae-in and his wife. The middle-aged woman hopes that her husband will be released by the North Korean government along with the other passengers, as she is tired of the constant accusations against her family. In short, North Korea eventually released the passengers in stages, from 11 to 39 people. However, the pilot and the remaining passengers were detained, as the negotiations to release everyone failed. Additionally, North Korea needed people with specific skills to help build the nation. As a result, the pilot's wife and the families of the other detained passengers could only lament their fate. Knowing this, Tae-in recalls the words of the commander, who had said that his decision at the time was unwise. Now, Tae-in doesn't know how to atone for his mistake. The next day, North Korea contacts South Korea, stating that they will claim the pilot and the 10 other passengers. In other words, they will become North Korean citizens and will never be able to return to their homeland. At the same time, the man who hijacked the plane is rewarded with $2 million by North Korea for bringing skilled individuals to the country. A year later, in 1971, Sokcho Airport is seen crowded with prospective passengers. However, South Korea's aviation system was still disorganized, with many vendors able to enter the airport. After an airplane is preparing for takeoff, which amazes the prospective passengers. At that time, South Koreans still considered airplanes one of the 7 wonders of the world. Surprisingly, one of the people piloting the plane is Tae-in. After leaving the Air Force, Tae-in decided to switch careers and became a co-pilot for commercial flights. This time, Tae-in is accompanying a senior pilot called Captain Q-Seek. Elsewhere, a young man named Young-dae appears very suspicious, as he tries to befriend a young boy so that the airport authorities won't suspect him. Shortly afterward, the passengers rush to board the departing plane. Unfortunately, the ticketing system was unclear, which resulted in many people were worried they wouldn't get a seat. Even worse, the tickets were not sold with assigned seats, so passengers scrambled to claim the most comfortable spots. In addition, smoking was still allowed on planes back then, and amid the disorder, one woman even brought a chicken on board. After takeoff, the passengers were in awe of the breathtaking view from above. At the same time, Young-dae became lost in his thoughts, reflecting on his tragic life. His parents had passed away, and his brother had disappeared. Unexpectedly, the reason Youngdae was on this flight was to meet his missing brother. Feeling sorry for him, the woman who owned the chicken gave Youngdae an egg that had just been laid by her chicken. In short, Youngdae stood up from his seat to retrieve something, and unexpectedly, what he took out was a homemade bomb. All the passengers were shocked and began to panic. Youngdae then threw the bomb toward a security officer named Chung Bae, who immediately ordered the other passengers to duck as the bomb was about to explode. The situation inside the plane became chaotic, and the aircraft briefly went out of control. Fortunately, Taein managed to maneuver and regain control. Once the plane stabilized, Taein noticed that many passengers had fainted due to the intense turbulence. Thankfully, there was no engine damage or structural damage to the plane. Not long after, Youngdae entered the cockpit and forced Captain Cusick and Taein to redirect the flight toward the sea. If they didn't comply, Youngdae threatened to detonate the bomb again. Calmly, Taein followed his orders for the safety of the passengers, while also checking the chaotic condition of the plane. At that moment, Taein noticed a flight attendant named Ok-soon, who had just regained consciousness after fainting. Near her, there was a hole caused by the bomb that Youngdae had set off. As a result, Taein quickly sealed it to stabilize the plane until they could land. Taein then discreetly explained the hijacking situation to Ok-soon, instructing her to find Chung Bae's missing pistol, as it was the only way Taein could threaten Youngdae in return. Once all the passengers had regained consciousness, they immediately asked Taein what was going on. As one of the individuals responsible for the flight, Taein tried to calm the passengers and reassure them that everything would be okay. However, this didn't last long, as Youngdae soon returned and ordered all the passengers to duck their heads and stay silent. Then, while showing his homemade bomb, Youngdae revealed that the flight's destination was North Korea. Upon hearing this, everyone panicked, not wanting to suffer the same fate as those who were taken to North Korea 2 years ago. Meanwhile, Captain Cusick secretly informed the airbase about the hijacking, which infuriated Youngdae when he overheard it. As a result, Youngdae once again threatened the two pilots, forcing them to obey his commands. Taein could have fought and overpowered Youngdae, but he was more concerned about the safety of the passengers, so they chose to find another way. In short, Taein instructed Ok-soon to treat Captain Cusick's left eye, which had started losing vision due to the earlier turbulence. While receiving treatment, the captain asked Youngdae why he decided to hijack the plane. Through their conversation, it was revealed that Youngdae was the younger brother of the hijacker from 2 years ago. His older brother was a former South Korean Special Forces member who chose to side with North Korea, which could offer him a better life. For that reason, Youngdae also decided to hijack the plane, as he wanted to reunite with his brother in North Korea. Hearing this, Taein's guilt resurfaced. Meanwhile, one of the passengers secretly rallied others to ambush Youngdae. Initially, the passengers refused, as it was too dangerous, but rather than doing nothing, they eventually agreed to the plan. Shortly afterward, Youngdae saw Chung Bae, who had just regained consciousness after fainting. He immediately took a rope and ordered 2 other passengers to tie up the security officer. At the same time, the plane suddenly experienced unexpected turbulence, causing Youngdae to lose focus. One of the passengers immediately took advantage of this opportunity to attack Youngdae. Initially, the man managed to overpower him, but unexpectedly, Youngdae pulled out Chung Bae's pistol, which Taein had been searching for. With the pistol, Youngdae regained control of the plane. To ensure that no one dared to defy him again, Youngdae even stabbed the leg of the man who had attacked him with a knife. Feeling sorry for the injured man, Ok-soon bravely asked for permission to tend to his wounded leg. After that, Youngdae warned Taein to continue flying the plane to North Korea. Moreover, Youngdae threatened to kill everyone if Taein tried to plan anything without his knowledge. Despite this, Taein secretly took action by destroying the fuel gauge to make it appear as if they were running out of fuel. This way, Taein could deceive Youngdae into believing that they had flown far and were close to reaching North Korea. To reinforce the deception, Captain Cusick made an announcement, stating that the plane had entered North Korean airspace, and requested that all passengers hand over their identification cards for destruction. This was done to ensure that North Korea would not be able to identify the passengers, so the communists wouldn't be able to determine which people could be claimed and which couldn't. Among the passengers was a prosecutor who was unwilling to hand over his identification card, as he had just been appointed by the ministry. However, out of fear that her son would be taken to North Korea, his mute mother quickly grabbed the card and swallowed it before Youngdae could see. As the passengers were collecting their identification cards, Yongdae suddenly remembered the events of 2 years ago, when his family was constantly accused of being communist due to his older brother's betrayal. The South Korean police even framed Yongdae and imprisoned him for a year. To make matters worse, when he was released from prison, Yongdae was consumed with anger as he learned that his mother had died of starvation. From that moment on, Yongdae was determined to follow in his brother's footsteps, believing that South Korea was no longer a safe or comfortable place for him. Meanwhile, Chung-bae whispered to a nearby passenger, asking him to untie his hands. Chung-bae then said that he could end the hijacking before they reached the border. While the passenger attempted to loosen the ropes, Ok-soon stood near Chung-bae to block Yongdae's view of the situation. Unfortunately, the passenger failed as the ropes were tied too tightly. Soon after, Yongdae heard an alarm, which Captain Q-seek explained was a sign that the plane had run out of fuel. Feeling deceived, Yongdae immediately struck Captain Q-seek on the head. Taein then tried to convince him by showing the fuel gauge, which indeed indicated that the fuel was depleted. As a result, Taein suggested making an emergency landing, as the plane had already crossed into North Korean territory. Unfortunately, Yongdae wasn't easily fooled and soon realized that the plane was still in South Korean airspace. Furious, Yongdae pulled the pin from a grenade and ordered a teenage passenger to hold it. Yongdae then threatened to kill the boy if Taein didn't continue flying the plane to North Korea. Unwilling to let the boy suffer, Taein decided to comply with his orders. Still angry about being lied to, Yongdae shot Taein in the leg, prompting Captain Q-seek to angrily confront Yongdae. He explained that if Taein couldn't fly the plane, they would all die, especially since his own vision was deteriorating. Therefore, he emphasized that Taein was the only one capable of piloting the plane. Feeling insulted by the captain's words, Yongdae retorted that death was preferable to living miserably in South Korea. He also brought up the tragic death of his mother. Hearing the commotion, Taein tried to calm Yongdae by saying that he had no problem going to North Korea with him. Furthermore, he was willing to sacrifice his own life, but he pleaded for the passengers to be let off the plane first, as it wasn't fair to drag them along. Taein then requested an emergency landing for 5 minutes to allow the passengers to disembark. While Yongdae was considering the situation, 2 South Korean fighter jets suddenly appeared as the commercial plane was approaching the border area. Unexpectedly, one of the fighter pilots was Dong-chul, so he immediately requested Taein to turn the plane around. Unfortunately, he couldn't respond to Dong-chul's message. Therefore, Taein tried to convince Yongdae that the fighter jets would shoot if they didn't turn back. However, Yongdae didn't believe it, as 2 years ago, the fighter jets didn't fire at all. At that moment, Taein once again felt guilty about the past event and was determined to find a way to secure all the passengers. Taein asked Ok-soon to press the intercom when the fighter jets appeared behind the plane's wings. When Yongdae went to the back to check on the jets, Taein took the opportunity to respond to Dong-chul's message via the radio, explaining that the plane was being hijacked. Unexpectedly, Dong-chul was informed by his superiors that North Korea was sending fighter jets to blow up Taein's plane if it dared to cross the border. Sure enough, there were 8 North Korean fighter jets ready at the border area. Seeing this, Ok-soon pressed the intercom as a signal. With all his strength, Taein also made a sudden maneuver to avoid contact with the North Korean fighter jets. In this life-and-death situation, Taein suddenly heard the code Fox 5 over the radio. As a former military man, Taein understood that Fox 5 indicated that one of the South Korean fighter jets was about to launch a missile. Before that could happen, Dong-chul kept persuading Taein to land the plane before North Korea fired its missile. However, since the situation didn't allow it, Dong-chul protected Taein's plane by positioning himself between it and the fighter jet piloted by his comrade. At the same time, Dong-chul explained to headquarters and his comrade that the commercial plane was being hijacked. In the cockpit, Captain Q-seek praised Taein for not giving up, even though he was severely injured. After hearing the captain's words, Taein came up with an idea to avoid the approaching North Korean attack. With no other choice, Taein daringly performed an inverted flight with a commercial plane, a technique typically used by small military aircraft, as it involved flying upside down. Unexpectedly, Taein managed to pull it off with the large plane, causing Yongdae and the passengers to be tossed around inside. Fortunately, this maneuver kept the plane safe as it did not cross the border between the two countries. While everyone was panicking, Ok-soon took advantage of the moment to try and untie Chung-bae. At the same time, Dong-chul's fighter jet and his comrades refrained from firing since the commercial plane had turned back. Seeing that the situation was more under control, Taein asked Captain Q-seek to take over the plane for a while, while he rushed to tackle Yongdae, who was struggling. Chungbei, now free, pointed his gun at Yongdae and ordered him to stop or be killed. Cornered, Yongdae resorted to using the bomb he had brought as a threat. Frustrated, Chungbei finally fired his gun. Before he died, Yongdae stared blankly ahead, shed a tear, and collapsed in front of Taein. Unfortunately, Yongdae had already lit the fuse on the bomb, prompting Taein to try to prevent the explosion by covering the bomb with a metal plate. Although the bomb went off, Taein's action successfully prevented a larger blast. In the end, all the passengers survived. Afterward, Chungbei approached Taein, who had lost his left arm due to the explosion and was bleeding profusely. Seeing this, one of the passengers felt sympathy and quickly brought a first aid kit to help the pilot. While Taein was being treated, Chungbei asked the passengers to find Yongdae's grenade pin to prevent any remaining bombs from detonating. Simultaneously, Chungbei also instructed the passengers to plug the holes in the plane to prevent the situation from worsening. At that moment, the passengers worked together to do everything they could to save the plane. Unfortunately, just as they were about to land, the plane's landing gear suddenly jammed, prompting Taein to assist Captain Q-Seek, who had lost his vision completely. With his remaining strength, Taein tried to atone for his mistakes from 2 years ago. Seeing that Taein was struggling, Aksun and the passengers worked together to pull the landing gear lever. Though they managed to deploy the landing gear, the plane's fuel was nearly depleted, and Taein's condition was deteriorating. In his critical state, Taein thought of his wife at home and the mistakes he made 2 years ago. Deep down, he wondered if all his sacrifices had been enough to atone for them. Moments later, Taein regained consciousness and began landing the plane on a beach. Thanks to his efforts, the entire crew and passengers landed safely. However, Taein passed away, leaving behind a wife waiting for him to return. At the end of the film, we are shown real footage of the plane landing. As the film tells us, everyone on the plane returned safely, except for the pilot and the hijacker. Meanwhile, the 11 people taken to North Korea have never returned to this day. Moral lesson from the story: always check if the pilot has a grenade before you fly, or you might end up with a very explosive vacation. And remember, next time someone says they have a chicken on board, make sure it's not a disguise bomb.